For 200 years, the UK's rail network has moved passengers from place to place. Tens of thousands of men, women and children have boarded trains every single day since those earliest journeys. For the vast majority, the journey ends without incident, but for an unlucky few, something goes wrong and the railway adds another disaster to the record books. We tell the stories of those darkest days and the people caught up in them. Welcome to Signals to Danger.
3 people have died after a passenger train derailed near Stonehaven in Aberdeenshire this morning and caught fire.
We went through a massive fireball. I could feel the heat coming through the windows and all the windows I could see were just orange.
36 people were killed and more than 100 injured in this morning's train crash at Clapham Junction in South London. 2 commuter trains carrying more than 1,300 passengers collided shortly after 8 o'clock. A third train ran into the wreckage.
Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the Signals to Danger podcast for our 30th of June's Rail Safety Review. I am, of course, Dan, and I am the producer of Signals to Danger. This is, in the way that I measure what's a real episode or not, our 60th episode of the podcast. That includes our full accident breakdowns and our rail safety reviews / RAIB roundups. But, wow, episode 60, that feels a million miles away from where we were back in 2020, I believe it was, when we started out, and I produced the very, very, very first episode of Signals to Danger covering the accident at Great Heck with a 20 or 30 pound boom arm / microphone / some other bits and bobs set that I got from Amazon, initially setting out to make YouTube videos. I've told the story of how that all came about once or twice, I think, on the podcast before, but maybe one day we'll go back through it. But yeah, 60 episodes and several years later. If you have been around since the very earliest days, or if you've taken the trouble to go back through the back catalogue, thank you so much for being a part of it. Anyway, that is enough of that. On to today's episode. If you have been before, you'll know that Rail Safety Reviews are the episodes where we examine what is essentially current affairs in the world of railway safety. The content we will be covering will be very much dependent on what's been taking place in the time since last we spoke, and what's going to vary depending on whether or not the RAIB have released a little or a lot in the 2 weeks preceding. As ever, I will hasten to add that minimal info from the branch is a good thing. It means there haven't been much in the way of accidents for them to discuss. On the plus side, railway safety is something of a very interesting area even without active incidents to discuss, so I'll always be able to find something to talk about. Which means that even now, when at the time of writing, the RAIB hasn't released any news reports or publications, although I'm fairly confident there might be a slight derailment on the West Coast Main Line with a 350 coming off on some points that might see itself making its way into a news article, but I've got very, very limited information about that so far, and I'm really not one to speculate or talk too much about stuff I don't know that much about, but maybe that's going to be something we'll talk about in our next rail safety review. In any case, with that lack of actual news issuance is a word I've just entirely made up. News reports being issued or reports being published. I am going to fill your time today with some other things that I hope you will find as interesting as ever. To start with, we are going to rewind the clock a little bit and get something from the RAIB, and it's going to be a little run through of their annual report from 2024. And then after that, we're going to take a little look at it initially started out as it was going to be a little look at human factors and as a concept, what that actually is. But I'm going to expand on that slightly. We're going to talk about human factors and some other incident factors as well that are considered when someone is investigating an operational incident. So, introed as ever. Let's get going. cast your mind all the way back to May of this year, and while all of us were enjoying weather that was typically changeable, dependent on, well, purely just absolute luck, apparently, the RAIB was hard at work putting the finishing touches on their report for the preceding year. Every year, this is something that the branch does, summing up the activities of the year before, pulling out key points for the industry and wider public to digest. So, without further ado, let's take a little look at their annual report. The first part of the document is formed out of the Chief Inspector's Review, and this is from Andrew Hall, who has been with the RAIB since the branch's inception, and in the role since 2022, having formerly served as Deputy Chief Inspector for 7 years. Andrew opens by referencing the changing state of the UK rail industry, stating that 2024 was a year of uncertainty and change for the British mainline rail industry, which is absolutely very true. However, while the structure of the industry is changing, the RAIB's purpose remains unchanged. That is, to investigate accidents, to improve railway safety, and inform the industry and the public. And this, for me, is a really key point that, well, needed saying, and it's very accurate. It's whatever rail looks like over the next few years, the next decade, who entirely dependent on who's in power potentially. The investigation impartially of dangerous occurrences must remain as it is. The existence of and the role of the RAIB will need to remain broadly unchanged, despite whatever else is happening within the industry. So while the industry is changing, Mr. Hall also makes references to changes within the branch itself, a number of staff retiring, and 5 new investigators joining the ranks. He also highlights that in the wake of government spending cuts, a sentence we've heard a lot of from various different areas, especially within the rail industry, an 8% reduction in headcount was also required by the RAIB. Now, on principle, I can't say that this is something that I agree with. The RAIB is not particularly the largest department of a somewhat bloated public sector, but I am confident they'll continue to do the good work that they have since 2024, even though Andrew acknowledges that this will present challenges. Moving on then, the annual report goes on to summarise the work of the branch in 2024, and in something that they generally tend to do, divides this activity into 6 main themes that have run throughout their investigative activities throughout the year. And I do love this because it's a good way of showing the trends. There tends to be certain things that do keep happening and they do change and progress year on year. So the first of these is one we've spoken about quite a lot: track worker safety. So Network Rail has reduced the amount of track work carried out on or close to lines that are open using unassisted lookouts to almost zero. So basically, there's virtually no circumstances now where people are working on the track and a guy is there looking for trains and warning them when to turn up. That's just not really the way it's worked. It's a concept I believe was called red zone working. It just doesn't really happen anymore because near misses and accidents are not fun and risk removal. It makes perfect sense. But it doesn't mean that near misses have stopped entirely regarding track workers. There have been a 60%, 60, it's a massive reduction since 2018, but that rate of reduction is recognised to have plateaued at this point, and there were a number of occurrences last year. In fact, there were a number of safety digests, that we've talked about some of them, and there has been a report as a result of serious near misses with track workers. While more work is being undertaken on tracks that are blocked, the report states that the understanding of exactly where a track worker or a group is, in relation to which lines are blocked, is critical. Because, well, we spoke 2 weeks ago about people working in a tunnel when they thought the line was blocked, but it was a different tunnel that had the block. So, while improvements have been made, there is clearly still more to do. The second theme, one I'm fairly hot on myself as a former station staff and a former station manager, is platform safety. It's always been to me one of the most risky areas where we actively bring people and trains close together, and the line I've used before is the heavy, hard metal trains. This is where they hang out with the soft, squishy people. Everyone's railway journey, pretty much everyone's railway journey, starts and ends with a platform. So making that safe for people is key and important. This last year, we've seen a number of trap and drag incidents, including 2 on the underground at Chalk Farm and Archway, but we've also seen some less typical station incidents be investigated. There was that unsafe movement of a train at Style. That's the nice way the branch named it. And that saw a train depart the platform without its doors closed and actually without its guard as well. In the addition, there was also that chaotic evacuation of an underground train at Clapham Common that made it all over social media and saw its own report as well. The points that were identified in this area were varied, as well they should be, because the incidents themselves were also very varied. But they included public education, the efficacy of safety checks, and the technology that was in use. In addition, the fact that staff involved in some of these incidents found it difficult to quickly move from a relatively low workload state to a high-performing state that's required when undertaking safety-critical dispatch tasks or while dealing with out-of-course events. This is the underload argument that we've talked about in the past, where it's difficult when you get overloaded and you have a lot to focus on all the time. It's really difficult to keep that focus, but actually you can be underloaded as well, going through a period of time within your work where you're not actually being demanded on to do an awful lot of complicated stuff. That can be problematic because you can't switch easily from sitting here, watching that, just watching it move by. Oh God, I've got to do something really serious. It's hard to ramp up that quickly. So underload and overload can both be big problems. The third theme that's discussed in the report was quite a serious and formal sounding one: asset integrity. In fact, this theme focused on 2 specific incidents, one of which was one of the more significant incidents of the year. But briefly, we're going to touch on Yarton, where a bridge wing wall had collapsed and a GWR train struck rubble on the track. This wing wall had a hidden defect, which wasn't found during inspection and maintenance, and the wall was already known to be in poor condition. The second of the 2 incidents was the quite spectacular sinkhole which appeared on the line at Grange over Sands, derailing a nice early morning northern service. In this case, the area had been subject to long-term flooding problems, and after many years a temporary pipe had been installed in the ballast close to the surface of this embankment, pumping water back across to the seaward side of the embankment that the track ran across. Now, in March, the pipe was punctured during track maintenance, and this caused water to get into the embankment core, water under pressure as well. So, although the pipe damage was reported, action was not then taken to avoid part of the embankment collapsing under a train 3 days later. This theme's kind of wrapped up by Andrew saying that UK rail assets are often old and have no reliably documented history. That's fair to say, considering there's an awful lot of it that we built several years ago. It's Rail 200, and there's plenty of stations that I've been to that have recently celebrated things like their 175th anniversary or 150th. It's a lot of our network is very, very old, and yeah, the Victorians were pretty good at building stuff. They weren't always great at keeping very detailed records about when it was built or how it was built or, how to check up on it. So, this lack of reliably documented history, Andrew continues, can create considerable difficulty for Network Rail and other infrastructure managers, which at the moment is compounded by climate change, particularly increased rainfall. As with track worker and platform safety, asset integrity has been a theme in recent RAIB reports, and the railway is putting a lot of effort into understanding and managing the risk associated with climate change and the effect that has on the integrity of assets. Those 2 incidents described there, well, they illustrate exactly why that continues to be essential. Moving on to theme 4 then, this is related to the safety of the line after engineering, and it's something we've seen a lot of issues around of late. If you cast your mind back to last year, We're talking about two safety digests, High Dyke Junction and Kings Langley, both of which relate to trains striking parts of temporary road rail access points that had been left behind after engineering work the night before. And then add on to the fact that in March last year, a passenger train derailed at Walton-on-Thames after it hit a bit of redundant rail that was just left on the tracks. This might sound like something we've done a lot on recently, but it's not a new issue. In 2018, the RAIB issued urgent safety advice, which was called Safety of the Line After Engineering Work. This was in response to a number of incidents in the past 4 years, which resulted in lines being reopened to traffic when the line wasn't in a safe condition. Now, back in 2018, the branch's advice was that Network Rail should take urgent action to review the effectiveness of the steps it has already taken to address those risks, and to implement any additional measures required to ensure the safety of the line following engineering works. Now, definitely not to belittle Network Rail, as they have undertaken considerable work in the area, but recent events illustrate that a significant level of risk remains. Also linked to the idea of track work is Theme 5, the safe operation of plant within engineering possessions. In 2024, the RAIB has investigated a number of incidents involving plant operated in possessions when work is carried out, while the railway is closed to normal traffic. So, at Stroud, an operative was struck and injured by a tamper, which moved after it was struck by a multi-purpose vehicle. Braiding on the Island line saw a road rail vehicle strike a worker, and in May, a track trolley struck workers in an instant. I mean, this one does scare me. The way I've written the script is an incident terrifyingly similar to the fatal one which took place in Tebay in the early 2000s, and that was a really horrible fatal accident, and yeah, something very, very similar happened again last year. Now, this particular area, all of the incidents that the branch investigated were very different and had varying causes, but in the battle of man versus machine, generally speaking, man will not win. And I agree with the branch's comment, which was the number of incidents that the RAIB has dealt with of this kind in 2024 is concerning. The final theme of the year then is one we've also discussed at great length, and it is the management of trees. Well, vegetation. So, as the branch states, the management of vegetation is vital for the safe operation of the railway. Trees can fall onto the track and be struck by trains, and vegetation can more generally affect the stability of structures and earthworks. Foul running lines, block visibility of signals, and get too close to high voltage and overhead electrification equipment. So, at both Broughty Ferry and Roundham Heath, trees fell onto the track from land outside the railway and were struck by passenger trains at speed. While this in itself is very problematic, we know that second-hand issues vegetation causes can be just as impactful. As we discussed a few weeks ago, leaf fall-induced low adhesion was a factor in the collision between two passenger trains at Salisbury Tunnel Junction, behind which lay some issues with vegetation management, and the accident at Oh, I almost forgot how to pronounce that one. So, Tullerthig is still under investigation, but we do already know that low wheel rail adhesion played its part there. The report then moves into some closing thoughts, much in the way that I do when I wrap up a main episode. And, the first line of this is something that I utterly agree with. That it has been almost universally accepted for many years from learning from accidents and incidents improves railway safety. There is an element of what I perceive to be a word of warning to the industry immediately after this phrase, however. Spital Junction, just to the north of Peterborough Station, is a name that has come up a few times in the last year or so. In fact, in May last year, the branch published a report about dangerous overspeeding through the junction that had taken place in 2023. And in that report, a reference was made to an almost identical incident which had taken place the year before. Same place, similar error, same danger to passengers. Of these incidents, Andrew Hall writes, during the 2022 incident, a train crossed the 30-mile-an-hour limited junction at around 76 miles an hour, a speed at which it is likely some of the wheels lifted off the rails and close to a speed that could have caused the train to overturn. Thankfully, a serious incident had been narrowly avoided, but 13 months later in this incident, the Slayham junction was crossed at 66 miles an hour in similar circumstances. This, once again, reinforces why learning from previous accidents and incidents and taking effective action in response to them is a vital means of improving safety and avoiding repeating mistakes of the past. The final comments then go on to highlight two other examples of incident which have mirrored those previously taking place, and states that throughout the 200-year history of the railway, many of the big advances in safety have been driven by learning from accidents. While we have got much more sophisticated in managing risk over that time, the expectation that accidents will not be repeated remains as real and reasonable as ever. The report then moves on to provide some statistics about the number of reported incidents, investigations, some info about how they work with other partners, as well as information on recommendations that have been issued. But I'm not going to go through all of that in this episode. That report is freely available on their website. However, it is there if it's something you're interested in reading. I find it very interesting, but I'm not just going to read it out word for word for you. I just wanted to focus in on the themes and the sort of the chairman's report. But just to close out, I'm going to point out that this is the 20th such annual report that the branch has published, and in that now quite long history, they've made quite the impact. I won't write my own sonnet to how important they are, although I'm pretty sure I wear my heart on my sleeve with that one. I'm just going to share this paragraph from the publication and let it speak for itself. On the 17th of October 2005, the RAIB started investigating railway accidents, making the 2024 annual report the 20th to be published. By the end of 2024, we had deployed to accidents 752 times and published 419 full reports and 134 safety digests or bulletins. These included 1,873 recommendations and 700 safety messages and learning points, all intended to improve railway safety. Over that period, UK railways have become much safer thanks to the combined efforts of the industry, its safety regulators and RAIB. This, and the difference our work can make to those who have had the misfortune to be involved in accidents, makes it particularly important and worthwhile. See? I told you it was worth having them around, isn't it? Righto, that section went on for a little bit longer than I thought it was going to, but I must have thought it was worth saying, or well, I'd have saved myself the typing and speaking, wouldn't I? So, factors, then. I mentioned human factors briefly at the end of last week's episode on Pearly, so I thought it might be worth expanding on it somewhat, as it is, well, it's an important concept in the understanding of the causal factors involved in incidents. So with that in mind, I'm going to do a quick rundown of what human factors are, but it's difficult to talk about human factors without also talking about incident factors and then human performance factors, both of which sit within the overarching sort of framework of human factors. So it might be a bit wordy, and I'm going to say factors a lot as part of this, so I apologise for that, but this should give a reasonable grounding of some of the things that modern accident investigations consider. It might be a little bit fast-paced, but let's have a jog through it. And I say a jog, but I'm really getting out of breath again this episode. Right. Let's open by pulling a definition straight out of a rail industry guidance note. That is GEGN 8613, the application of human factors within safety management systems. Catchy title. I'll never get bored of that joke. I really do enjoy it. Human factors is a discipline which aims to optimize human performance through understanding the relationship between people and the systems they interact with. It brings together the different components of the workplace and looks at how they integrate to allow people to work their potential while staying safe. When human factors principles are applied, it can help organisations to improve work processes and reduce the likelihood of errors occurring when individuals are completing tasks. The human factors discipline breaks down the factors that affect human performance into 3 interrelated groups: individual factors, job or workplace factors, and organisational factors. Now, those 3 areas, they're all focused differently, but they work together as an interlinked and almost interdependent system to influence how humans work in any given set of circumstances. The 3 are individual, job or workplace, and organisational factors. Now, individual factors are, in something that won't be much of a plot twist, those factors which stem from individuals themselves and can affect their work performance. So that might be fatigue or well-being, their experience or their attitudes. And with a list of factors like that, it's easy to understand how they could be the kind of things that would affect how somebody does their job. From the perspective even of investigating accidents, understanding things like how fatigued a driver or signaller may have been could be key. Their well-being, if it wasn't great, could have led to distraction or poor decision-making, and, well, similar could be said about people's experience or attitude. Job and workplace factors, they're also fairly ronseal. It's relating to how the design of work can affect the performance of people. The key area of focus here is how tasks have been designed and how other factors such as shift patterns, how the working environment's set up, whether people have the right equipment to do the job they're supposed to be doing. Now, the guidance note there adds a good example of it. So when workplace factors do not match the requirements of the people completing the work, it creates greater risk of errors and accidents. So, for example, if a working environment's really noisy, but the task that they're undertaking relies on verbal communication, that could inhibit communications, or staff might feel the need to take a risk and remove some PPE like ear defenders to talk or a face mask to read each other's lips. Or maybe they leave the safe bit of the depot or workshop or wherever that they're in to communicate and adapt outside of what the rules are. Those final sets of factors, the organisational ones, they relate to wider culture and characteristics of an organisation itself. Now, this could be how a business manages change, the safety culture that's in place, or how management is undertaken. Now, organisational factors aren't often identified as the immediate causes of incidents, but they can be some of the most influential in understanding why errors occur, and when you trace back an incident to its root cause, it's not unheard of for an organisational decision to have influenced what's happened on the ground, potentially miles away. When we investigate an incident, I say we, I have undertaken operational incident investigations, obviously not for the branch, more of an internal situation, but I have undertaken investigations and I have used human factors as part of that. But human factors on their own aren't as helpful as including the concept of incident factors with it. And there are incident factors, and there are 10 of them in fact. These factors allow us to group the things that are involved in an incident into one of 10 distinct areas and assess how those factors influenced events. Now, it's worth noting here, and I'm not going to go into that much detail today, but each of these incident factors can be split out into sub-factors, about 5 or so of each of them. Not going to do that today, maybe one day, but if through your work, and some of you will have this, if you have access to the RSSB online document library, go and have a quick read of RIS 3119 TOM. So RIS, Rail Industry Standard 3119 TOM, TOM. That is the standard which deals with accident investigation. It's got it's chunky, I'll put it that way, but it's got a really detailed breakdown of incident factors and sub-factors and some great examples of each of them. And if you ever find yourself in a situation where you are having to investigate an incident, it's a brilliant document for the guidelines as to how to do that. If you haven't, do a bit of research on incident factors and human performance factors, human factors, because there is a lot of stuff out there outside of what's available for the industry, and it can make for some really fascinating reading. And if you're bored of the word factors by now, I'm really sorry, this might not be the episode for you, because I'm going to say it again, I'm so sorry. Incident factors, the first one of them then, is verbal communications. So that might relate to something like conversations between drivers and signallers, or a phone call between two operatives in a possession. Maybe important information was omitted or misunderstood. Next, we have processes and procedures documents. Sounds fairly obvious, but for example, this looks at whether a process was written in a way that influenced the behaviour of those involved to the detriment of the day. Perhaps a process was never actually drawn up for that activity, or if there are procedures in place, are they available to people who need to see them, or are they locked in a cabinet on the other side of the building? Written information on the day comes up next, and in the context of a driver, this might be the diagram that they've been provided with, or it could be paperwork issued to contractors working within a possession, instructing them how to undertake works. If it's inaccurate, or if it led somebody to make a decision, that could be a factor in the incident. Again, we could be looking at information being incorrect or missing as potential features to look out for here. Competence management, that relates to how a business has ensured that those who work for it have had the necessary competence for the tasks they're undertaking. Have their assessments been carried out in the right timeframes? Were the people undertaking the assessments competent themselves? Was training provided for the tasks being undertaken if it was meant to be done by that person? And then we have fatigue, health, and well-being. Well, I don't think I need to expand too much on these things, but if someone's not doing okay in one of those areas, like I said before, it could prove to be a factor in the investigation of any incidents. Workload, real or perceived, and resourcing is the next one. And this could absolutely be a factor in an incident, be it whether an operator is asking for too much from an individual or not allocating an appropriate number of people to undertake a role. Again, it's quite a self-explanatory one. Environmental conditions comes next. Lighting, weather conditions, noise levels, all that wonderful stuff. Again, very Ronseal. It's the factors of the environment, the condition of the environment this incident took place in. And now if environment looks at all the factors surrounding an incident, this next one looks at all the stuff actually involved in it. And it's infrastructure, vehicles, equipment, and clothing. So that would be your signalling, the trains themselves, uniforms, that sort of thing. Was it poorly designed? Did it provide the protection it was supposed to? And a really simple one that you can never forget to check. Did it work? Risk management is the penultimate factor, which I'm going to look at. Well, penultimate incident factor. And it's an area that I'm quite keen on the world generally paying attention to. In fact, I probably use the phrase risk management, or I probably use risk mitigation more. Risk avoidance. I'm very risk averse at work, but working within the rail industry, I have to be very risk averse. It's kind of what we do in a way. However, that might say more about me than anybody else, but risk management is a key area to consider as part of an investigation. Has a business successfully managed its risks, or hasn't it? Have activities that are being undertaken been risk assessed? Have the business responded well to, voiced concerns? The last one then, the last incident factor is team working and leadership. Have roles in a team been properly divided? Is everyone aware of what they're supposed to be playing, the part they're supposed to be playing in the process? Do the team dynamics allow members to challenge each other when their behaviour needs challenging? Hopefully you get the idea. That was the 10 instant factors. Very, very quick rundown. You might even need to go back and listen to it again. I feel like I've absolutely hammered through those ones, but I don't want to just drag on and waffle on for too long. So human factors, that group's out the way. Instant factors, we've talked about that. This might be a really good opportunity if you were really going to dive into it to start talking about non-technical skills. But non-technical skills, or NTS, is something that would take a whole other chunk of time to talk about. So it might make it a little bit too much to do that today. But I think that may form a part of another chunk like this on a rail safety review. we're going to close down this rapid fire, not said very well, but rapid fire rundown of things that are considered by investigators with one last little bit. And that's a look at human performance factors. So human performance factors, or HPFs, are basically the ways in which human actions can impact the events. It does include human error, and I know while I've recently spoken about not pinning accidents solely on an individual and blaming them, it doesn't stop the fact that human error absolutely can be a causal factor in an incident. And in all honesty, there are a large percentage of accidents or incidents where this is the case. Somebody made a mistake. But this mistake needs context, and it's important when we talk about this to understand that not all errors or not all human interventions are the same within an incident, and they can be grouped into distinct areas, which is these human performance factors. The first of these human performance factors is one which does cover off some of those situations where human error specifically is a factor, and it's slips or lapses. These are the errors which tend to happen in everyday tasks. Perhaps there's an element of autopilot involved. The people involved in these incidents likely knew what to do, knew the right thing to do, what was meant to happen at this point, but they did the wrong thing without realising. That's a slip or a lapse. Maybe they misread something, maybe they were distracted or they were rushing, perhaps they were biased because, well, that's always a green signal, and I've always been programmed to expect it to be a green signal, so I didn't expect it to be a yellow one. That's that biasing, that sort of thing. This sort of error is known as a slip or a lapse. And like I said, that is when the person involved knew the right way to do something, but they did it wrong because of an error. The other type of HPF which covers off human error is decision error. Now, in this situation, the difference is that person involved has consciously made a decision, but their choice was wrong. Now, that could be down to a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding. Maybe they misstood the situation. Perhaps they were sure that pressing that button would have this result, but it was actually something completely different. Now, we wouldn't call it decision error if the individual had simply forgotten the correct information, because that would be a lapse. But this is for situations where their understanding of what was involved was incorrect. The next human performance factor really doesn't need much expansion. It is simply asleep or unable to respond. Now, this is for situations where the person involved has influenced the incident, but perhaps they may have become incapacitated or have literally fallen asleep. Basically, they're unable to undertake the required task. There is one more HPF which can be used when it's difficult for the person undertaking the investigation to allocate one of the other HPFs, and it is don't know. So as the RIS says, there will be cases where the witness's recollection and available evidence do not allow the human performance factor type to be determined, although it is clear that human performance was a factor in the event. The final human performance factor then, well, this is the one that doesn't always make the individual being examined look or feel great. This one is less human error and leaves more of a question mark over the situation. Intentional rule breaking. This covers off a situation where the person involved absolutely knows what they're supposed to do and remembers and knows what's expected of them, but they make a conscious decision to not do that. Now, on the face of this sounds very sinister, but it's key to remember that there are reasons somebody may break the rules without intending to cause harm or for personal gain. Perhaps that person thought it was the right thing to do to prevent an incident from either happening or from getting worse. Perhaps pressures from their workload or encouragement from their managers, peers, or just all the people around them. Maybe it pushed them into breaking the rules to, and I use this phrase lightly, get the job done. Maybe that's where they had the idea in their head that this was more of a bend than a break. But intentional rule breaking would cover off all of those situations. So, massively out of breath, struggled a little bit tonight, but that is human performance factors. and also instant factors, both of which sit within the human factors framework. And I hope that didn't feel like it was too rushed. It was a whistle-stop tour. It was the express version. No, I'll stop. Right. I hope it was useful to you all, and it does allow you to sort of go away and have a little bit of a grounding in the kind of factors that people are looking for when they're investigating incidents. And anyway, that brings us wrapping up nicely to the end of another rail safety review. So thank you so much for joining. We will be back next Monday for another full episode. This one covering we'll get there, but the shocking derailment at Eltham-Well Hall. Thank you to everybody, especially those of you who support the podcast on Patreon. If you are interested in that or just supporting the podcast in general, there is a page on signals2danger.com that can help you out. All that remains to be said is to finish the episode in the same way I always do. And I told my wife the other day, Mrs. Signals, that I always end the podcast with the same 2 words, and her helpful suggestion was, "Love you." To point out, I don't generally tend to end the podcast with the words "love you," but you know what? 60 episodes in, if you guys keep turning up, heck yes, I love you. Anyway, we'll end it in the actual traditional way and say until next time we speak, travel safe.